Good morning, everyone. I am happy to be here, at least virtually. I am sorry that I'm not actually there in the physical location, but with the weather moving in and the fact that we have animals on the farm and we're in the ice band up here near Tripola, Iowa, it was a necessity to get back home so we can take care of the animals. That's just what happens sometimes. I was very much looking forward to being there in person. Just to get started, however, I wanted to point out that I am perfectly happy to take questions as we go. They'll be taking questions and putting them in the chat, and I will try to monitor the chat as we go through the presentation. And otherwise, we'll just make the best of it as we can. My name is Rob Fox. I am the owner-operator of the Genuine Fox Farm near Tripola, Iowa. For those of you who might have some fun with this, we have all kinds of names there that the pronunciations sure don't look like the words themselves. Those of you that know that fox is pronounced faux in French would probably catch the pun that faux means false or fake. So we are the Genuine Fake Farm, for those of you who like that kind of thing. I'm going to start by giving you a really quick preview of what our farm looks like, so you know what kind of background I'm coming from here. We started the Genuine Fox Farm in 2004. Our farm is 15 acres in size, so that is big enough to do a fair amount of growing. Our farm produces produce as well as poultry, and an average production number when we're at our peak would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 tons of food per year off of this farm. So it can do a fairly decent job. And you'll notice over on the right-hand side, that's where most of our vegetable production is. You'll probably notice a couple of high tunnels in the picture, some pasture area, and a couple of buildings, some of which are, of course, older and no longer in use. And one of our mottos on our farm is that a field we want to be in is a successful field. And I think you'll begin to understand what I mean by that as we go. On the present day, our farm at one point in time was a CSA program for distribution among some sales to restaurants and some other bulk accounts. But in 2019, we announced our last year for the CSA, and we have moved on to doing some things differently, moving towards larger bulk crops as opposed to trying to do so many different crops so that we can have distribution on a weekly basis. And part of that just has to do with getting older and with some injuries and not being able to keep up with that many crops all at once. And part of that's just how farms grow over time. They grow and change. So that's what our farm looks like. And let's get down to the business at hand. Today's presentation, we're going to focus on intercropping in vegetable systems. And this is something that I've been committed to since we started in 2004. And of course, one of the things that we did over time is we were looking to find ways that one could scale various intercropping approaches. And in gardeners speak, a lot of people would call this companion planting. But when we start talking about growing commercially, I prefer to think of it as intercropping. We're trying to often put a couple of crops together into a system so that we can introduce intentional plant diversity into our system. And there's four main ways that we tend to do this. The simplest is strip intercropping, where you would maybe have a bed of one crop and a bed of a different companion crop next to that, rather than having an entire plot or field with one monocrop. It gets a little more complex when you do row intercropping, so then maybe a particular vegetable bed would have more than one plant type or plant species in it. It gets even more complex if you move to mixed intercropping, where you just might happen to have in one row a couple of different species. And then, of course, the one that I think more people might do at some level is relay intercropping. And that's the idea that a particular bed or growing space would have one crop, and then perhaps another crop would start before that crop is completed or terminated. So an example of that would be, I know a number of people have grown tomatoes and they've started lettuce in the same bed, and the lettuce is harvested as the tomatoes begin to shade the bed, begin to cover the bed and take over. By the time that happens, your lettuce has been harvested. And that's a good example of relay intercropping. A couple of the things that I want to make clear too is a lot of these intercropping techniques can be two cash crops or two crops that you're looking to sell or distribute in some fashion. But I also want to point out that often you can get benefit from a support crop or a crop that is not intended to be sold or to add to your bottom line on the farm. A good example of that might be those of you who like to integrate cover crops into your system, a vegetable system, where you might have an open space in your grow plan and you want to keep the soil covered, and that would be a support crop. Or you might put flowers into the system as a pollinator attractor or other things to bring beneficials to your growing space. So what I want you to think about, those of you who are growers, I want you to think for a second about your planting map for your farm. And I want you to think about exactly how complex it is or how simple it is. And of course, that has to do sometimes with what you've chosen to grow. But I'm going to take a wild guess that most of us prefer a simpler plan because, of course, it feels easier to keep your head wrapped around it. But I'm going to challenge you a little bit and ask you to think about making your growing plans just a little more complex, but do it in smart ways where you can actually scale up and not necessarily set yourself back to the point that you can't farm effectively. And that's kind of where we're going with this intercropping presentation, is what are ways we can introduce this plant diversity in a way that is efficient and effective. So here are some things that I think are worth consideration when we're talking about intercropping. I think most of us who grow and have some background in growing agree that various plants can have the ability to either repel or attract pests, perhaps confuse them. They also have the ability to bring beneficials to an area. So I think we all know that this is the case. So the question is, can we use that knowledge? Another thing that maybe I think we recognize is that plants interact with each other. And the most common interaction that a grower will think about is competition. This is why we try to get rid of weeds, because we don't want them competing for the resources that are necessary. But I don't think we necessarily think enough about facilitation, that there are some crops that might actually aid other nearby crops. Something that I think is really important, especially for a small scale farm like mine, is space compatibility. There are times when you might be able to use your space better, especially if you do use intercropping. We can take a look at how we use our resources. One of the things I like to think about, I mentioned resources of light, water, and nutrients. I like to think about sun farming a little bit. We get a certain amount of sun, and if you can get more crop harvesting that sun over a period of time and producing product for you, then that's an efficient use of that particular resource. And I feel like intercropping can provide you with tools that can make that a little bit more efficient. Obviously, intercropping provides soil coverage, so we can reduce wind erosion. We can get more roots in the soil. All positive stuff. And then you can take a look at those last 2 points down there. Just consider the fact that we have different management practices for crops, and that each crop has some peak development stages we need to be aware of. Because if we're going to be doing intercropping, you want to think about the fact that they could compete with each other. And if you really do know about those peak development stages, there are ways you can work around some of that competition so that it isn't a problem. And this is probably a slide that most of you probably don't need to know, because if you aren't doing intercropping, you're probably pretty familiar with the reasons why you don't. There is a perception, and I think there is some truth to it, of course, is that the easy, simple system where you have one crop, you can be about as efficient as you can be as if everything is pretty much exactly the same stage of growth, same spacing, same requirements. And if you get into intercropping, every time you add a complexity, that makes it a little bit more difficult to work on. And I'm not here to tell you that there isn't more difficulty. What I'm here to tell you is it's manageable difficulty. And I think we need to tell ourselves this rather than trying to feed ourselves. I think it's a lie that any intercropping and any diversity is bad. There's a certain amount of it, I think, that we should be willing to pay because there are more benefits to it. Obviously, one of the things that might be true for you is that sometimes an individual crop in your set of intercrops may not yield exactly the same as it did when you grew it in a monocrop. That there is truth to that. But we'll discuss that a little bit later, that actually your ultimate yield is going to be similar or potentially better. And we'll just look at that towards the end. Your rotation could get more complex, especially if you're using two plants that are intercropped together that cross families. And now suddenly you have to realize that this area of your rotation is using up two different slots in your rotation. And this is probably the place where the complexity gets a little bit strong as far as that's concerned, because now you have to think a little harder about your rotation. And we'll just leave the other two there because I think they'll become obvious. So here's where we get kind of researchy on you a little bit. I just wanted to make a case for intercropping, and I did some and have been paying some attention to research over time. And I'm not going to read each one of these to you, and I'm not going to summarize each one of them. But the first point I do want to make is that we do know that a diverse biological system is a healthier one. There's plenty of research about that, and it's just a general piece of information. Is a diverse system is a healthy system. Of course, here we are wanting to grow food, and we're trying to do it in a way that's efficient. So we are sometimes in conflict with this, that we are looking to give support to a very specific crop because that's our goal. We want to sell it and we want people to eat it. So I understand that. But we still also can admit to ourselves that a diverse system is healthier. And just as an example, there was a study in California on broccoli that even the littlest bit of diversity can help. What they did is they actually grew a control where they had a monocrop of a certain kind of broccoli, all planted at the same time, all maturing at the same time. And then they planted a different plot where they actually grew 3 different varieties of broccoli, planted at the same time and in the same fashion. And they actually found that the common pests for broccoli were less. They were reduced when you actually do 3 different kinds of broccoli in one field in the same fashion as you would one kind of broccoli. Now, the extra complexity here, of course, is that the broccoli plants themselves probably have different maturity dates. So you're not going to clean that whole field out all at the same time with your harvest. So there's a little bit more difficulty, but not really much. But at the same time, they actually found a statistic change in the amount of pest pressure they had without using pesticides when they just added that much diversity. So imagine what we can get if we do a little bit more. You'll notice that there are several other studies here, but one of the things that I wanted to point out is one of the major changes that happens frequently is the fact that there is measurable decrease in inputs into your crops when you use intercropping. And I do want to make it very clear that one of the things that we as farmers often do is we get anxious because we want to see success, and we try something for 1 year, and if it doesn't meet whatever the big goal is, we tend to drop it. And that isn't necessarily the best approach because sometimes there's user error involved. And I think what a lot of folks learn with these studies is when you have repetition, you start using it over time and you start adjusting for your farm, your systems, your environment, you will find that you will have decreased inputs for your growing system. There is one study that just came out in 2023. And that's at the bottom of the screen. They actually did what's called a meta-analysis where they went out and found studies that exist. And there were 226 studies. And the summarization of what they found is that an intercrop system can produce similarly as far as amount of produce or amount of product as a sole crop system. So we're not looking at a decrease in yield overall. But at the same time, we have increased crop resilience. We're enhancing the ecosystem services and increasing nutrient use efficiency. That's the summary, the overall overarching achievement that comes from this amalgamation of 200 plus studies. So I guess when I look at things like this, I say, well, okay, if all things are still equal when we get to the end of this, that productivity is the same, that our labor costs and our complexity is reasonable, and we are actually getting these other benefits to begin with, then I begin seeing the case for intercropping being a lot stronger than the case for let's keep things really, really simple. So that's just kind of how I feel about it. And now let's get to the specific stuff on our farm where I can just talk about things that we do and how we do it and why we do it, because I think that's what most of you would like to hear versus Rob talking about studies he's read. So our first goal on our farm, and this may not match your farm, but the first goal on our farm when we started in 2004 and that we have been able to accomplish is that we do not use any pesticides, whether they're certified organic or not. We decided we were going to go without using them. And so we were trying to build an ecosystem on our farm where the natural services took care of the problems for us rather than relying on the pesticides to do so. And what you're seeing in this picture in front of you, this is an example of row and strip cropping, if you will. There's garlic that's well established in the field. You'll notice that we've got summer squash and zucchini in the paper mulch beds that are in between them. And this was part of one of the SARE grants that we have done over time. And we were trying to see if we could integrate a mulch like a paper mulch. You could probably do the same thing with a plastic mulch and do some strip or bed intercropping in the process. What you do not see in the picture very well at this time is there's actually some mixed intercropping in here, because every so many summer squash you see, there will be a nasturtium plant or a marigold plant in the middle of that. And there's some reasons for that. Among them is the fact that, of course, we would like to attract pollinators of some kind or another. Another thing that we like to do is if you're having trouble with disease vectors, sometimes if you put a different species plant in the middle of the row, you prevent plants of the same species from touching, and maybe you can actually react to a disease problem before it spreads its way down the row. Just some of the things that we try to do. And here's towards the end of the season example of all kinds of intercropping going on here. We've got strips, rows, and mixed intercropping in here. You'll see there's sweet corn, pie, pumpkin, zinnia, nasturtium. The sunflowers are over on the far side to the right, so you won't see that in this picture. But this is just an example of what it ends up looking like at the end of the season. And I will tell you that the productivity levels of our cash crops, of the squash and of the corn, and in fact the sunflowers, because we were able to harvest the seed, were all pretty much in line with what we expect on our farm for harvest. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So by putting them together, this seemed to work. There's some spatial compatibility here in that the vines can crawl right on into the corn. As you see, they also can crawl over the zinnias if they want to. The nasturtiums themselves, which you can't really see in the picture, are actually in the middle of that mass of vines, and they do just fine amidst the squash vines. Probably the biggest labor issue here, because the spacing of this is the squash rows were 5-foot spacing. We had the corn at 3-foot spacing. So pretty much normal spacing. Our cultivation techniques when they were young was still the same. So that was fine. And then at the point we get to this point where we've got full canopy, we're not worried about cultivation. The biggest issue at this point is harvest. But when we talk about harvest of things like winter squash, that's not really an issue either, because we harvest them all at once. It doesn't matter if you're stepping on vines or driving over vines in the process of harvesting. So in reality, the labor issue here was mostly trying to manage what are we planting, where does it going, and making sure they all get what they need as far as their necessary things. One of the things we did do in this field is we treated the flowers as if they were a crop, even though we didn't intend on harvesting them and selling the flowers. So those zinnia rows got a drip line just like the squash rows got. So they were getting irrigated in the same fashion on the same line as the squash rows. And so there is that cost that I'm running an additional line and not getting a crop out of it. But at the same time, the plants were healthy. The pollinator presence was extremely strong, as were things like toads and snakes and various other critters that we know will eat the pests that causes problems in these kinds of fields. So this was a very successful field. This was one that I enjoyed going to. I enjoyed walking in. I enjoyed taking pictures of, and I enjoyed harvesting because we had good crops all around. So here's our second goal when it comes to intercropping on our farm. We very much want to be friendly to pollinators. Our farm is surrounded by corn and soybean fields. And so it is sometimes hard for us to maintain a good pollinator population so that crops like melons and cucumbers, all these plants that really do need good pollinator presence, they can struggle if we don't do something to provide sufficient food, shall we say, and food over a period of time so that at the point our melons are blooming, the pollinators are already present and already healthy. So that's one of our goals. What you're seeing here, this is part of another SARE grant that we were involved in. What you're seeing in this field is the center is a mat of melons, and they are at this point in time in full bloom. And at the same time, you'll notice there are zinnias. You'll notice that there's a plant called borage on the right-hand side. There's some more melons to the left of the zinnias, more melons to the right of the borage. Other things in the field include calendula. We have a strip of buckwheat in this field. We also have on the far left that you don't see sun hemp, which we use to bracket the far side. And that wasn't necessarily for pollinators. It was for height. One of the things that can help is if you have height in a field, it can actually block wind. And if you block wind, that reduces evaporation, and that actually helps the plants that are your more sensitive plants to survive some of the dry, hot, windy days. And so we sometimes like to put brackets of taller plants on the edges of our fields for that particular reason. It's just a matter of finding the appropriate ones. Sometimes sunflowers are a good choice. You just have to recognize that sunflowers have allelopathic qualities, so they'll actually prevent germination in an area around them. We found that sun hemp, on the other hand, seemed to allow, just like the corn or watermelon vines in this field, to just grow right in there. The obvious problem with that is the sun hemp, of course, had to get waded through to harvest the watermelons. So from a labor standpoint, that wasn't such a good thing. But from a diversity and from a production standpoint, this field was very good. It worked extremely well for us. And just to show you that this same kind of a model wasn't just a one-year deal, here's another year where we managed to do something along those same lines. This time we actually included basil periodically in the rows, and the basil was actually planted in the squash rows to remind us when we changed a melon variety. So as they were growing, all we had to do was look for the little mound of basil, and it's like, okay, the variety changes there. You'll notice some unintentional diversity in this picture because it looks like I missed a buttonweed in the middle there. But in general, the canopy does a pretty good job of keeping most of the weeds out. You do your initial cultivation when the plants are small, and as the vines begin to spread, between them and between the thick rows of zinnias and borage, we find that once you've gotten that early cultivation done, the field stays pretty clean, which is a bonus. Because then the next year you haven't been adding to the seed bank as far as that's concerned for the weeds. So this is a fairly successful approach for us. So now let's talk about that particular experiment where we're putting vine crops with various pollinator crops, and we're allowing them to make a giant canopy. What you're seeing as far as flowers in this picture are concerned is Phacelia is on the right. Some people might call it bee's friend, and borage is on the left. And that was featuring prominently in the last two pictures. They're two of our favorites for providing both habitat for beneficials and for attracting pollinators. We find that frogs tend to like to be in the base of these plants, which is a good thing, and so do the snakes. So we're pretty happy to have them both there. But here's what we did. We were growing melons, and remember, our CSA program requires that we grow a lot of different crops. So if you're thinking, oh, gee, that's pretty small production for melons, remember, we're growing them as one of many crops. But you can see that our history for melon production, and these are marketable melons only, it was relatively small for the same size and the same number of plants, same amount of row feet from year to year. And as we got to 2014, what the difference was there is we actually did a little bit more with intercropping along the edges of the field that held the melons, and we noticed an increase in production. But we decided, you know, we're just going to go all out with this intercropping with our vine crops. So what I did is I planted 1/3 fewer melon plants in 2015. I just said, I'm going to cut that back, and I'm going to use that space, those row feet, to plant the things like the borage and the Phacelia and the zinnias. I decided to use that space, and I decided to use those companion crops and treat them as if they were a cash crop. So they got irrigation, they got cultivated. I treated them as if they were just as important as the melon crops. And we did observe over time that the pollinators were present, and that pollinators, especially bumblebees, are very responsive to the sizes of the flowers in your companions. So of course, you're looking for flowers that probably match or are closer to the flowers that your particular cash crop might have, because we want to see squash bees when we're looking at squash and when we're looking at melons. So that's part of what we're looking to do here. And so we did this work. Much of our herbs and flowers were seeded. We direct seeded them, whereas we transplanted our melon plants. And we seeded heavier than we normally would. We wanted to just have a habitat, and we wanted them to be strong. So we pretty much seeded the zinnia a lot closer than is normally recommended, and came up with a wall of zinnias in the process. The same thing with the borage. And what we found at the end of the year is that we actually had more melon production in 2015 and again in 2016 than we had in the prior years. And yet, remember, we're growing 1/3 fewer plants. Okay, so we're using the same amount of space. We're using fewer melon plants. We're treating the companion crops that we're not harvesting as if they were a harvestable crop. And we ended up getting more production out of those melon plants because we decided to do this intercropping product. And we've been doing this particular model now since 2015, and we continue to see the same kinds of harvest levels. So this isn't a one-off, folks. This isn't, I had a really good year in 2015, though we did, because you'll point out 2016, we had a little bit of regression, but we continue to have numbers that fall into that same level with the same amount of space. And I think that's a pretty good selling point as far as I'm concerned. So here's goal number 3. We would like to improve the fertility of our soil and the health of our soil. So here's an example where we've got multiple crops in one of our plots. And I probably would be remiss if I didn't point out there's also some perennial strips over here where we've got clover and grasses over on there that's maintained perpetually. The field you're looking at actually has trellised peas on the left, and then there's 2 rows of cucumbers, and then we're starting up some pole beans. This is probably about the point where we wanted to grow some late pole beans. And part of the reason for this is that we know we have cucumber beetle pressure on our farm. We also know that we can get frogs and snakes and toads to eat those. And we also know that to get them into the cucumbers, we want to provide habitat where they're there once those cucumbers begin growing so that they're already present. And so we put peas in the field, and those peas, of course, go in a lot earlier, and they're well established. And guess what? Some of our predators actually do like that as habitat, as a nice shady place to stay cool. And then we do find them frequently then in our cucumbers, and we don't have so much trouble with the cucumber beetle pest. What you don't see is on the other side of the peas are carrots, and then there's another row of peas. And this is another kind of intercropping that has nothing to do with pests. Well, actually, it does have something to do with pests. It has nothing to do with insect pests. What it has to do with is it has to do with deer. We frequently have problem with deer coming in and eating down our carrots and pawing up the roots and pretty much destroying a crop. So if we've got a crop like peas that doesn't seem to have any adverse effects on carrots, but we do have to trellis the peas, well, why not trellis the peas on opposite sides of the carrots? And all you have to do for fencing after that are the ends. And we found that we had no problem with deer in our carrots, and the damage the deer might do to our peas was negligible, especially in comparison to the losses we would have with the carrots. So this system actually worked pretty well. We also found deer don't particularly like walking through cucumbers. So this actually worked fairly well to try and help us deal with deer. Now, I will put a caveat on that as I go to the next thing. We need to remember that none of these things will eradicate all of any of your pests. What they do is they keep them to a point where your economic impact is reasonable. It's what you can actually absorb without having to expend that on other inputs such as pesticides. So that's kind of where we come from, is we're maybe not getting perfection, but we are doing it in a way where we're actually seeing less expense, whether we pay for it with a little bit of crop loss or we pay for it with the cost of pesticides and application. So I end up, in the end, I still end up doing a little bit better than if we had chosen to do this the other way. Here's an example where I've got bush beans in between eggplant. And part of the reason for that is because we do get Colorado potato beetle on both our potatoes and our eggplant. And we have found that one of the things that helps confound the Colorado potato beetle are bush beans, in particular green beans. And so sometimes what we will do is, even though we can't harvest all of the beans we've planted, sometimes I will grow them as a companion crop to help protect a crop that I need. And then what I will do at the end of the season is I can always harvest them as a seed, so I can use them in future years, or I can harvest them as a dry bean. So I have two options where the crop is not just there as a support crop. I can actually turn that into a cash crop or into a resource that I can use. This is a different picture of that 2015 melon field that I wanted to show. And this illustrates the strip of buckwheat that we had in between the melons and the watermelons. And this actually worked pretty well, with one exception, of course, and that's the buckwheat is going to flower and it's going to set seed. And at about the point it started setting the seed, I was not ready to get in there and mow that down, because we did have some vines, not many, that were actually rolling into the buckwheat at that point. So I wasn't willing to do that. So the net problem with that, of course, is now I have buckwheat seeds in this field and I'm going to have buckwheat volunteers. But I'll be honest with you once again, if I'm going to have weeds, something that's as easy to terminate as buckwheat doesn't worry me as much as something like Canadian thistle in my kind of system. So if I'm going to have a weed, this one's easy as far as I'm concerned. And this picture also shows you on the left the sun hemp, which is at that point probably about 2 feet tall. And it will reach, probably at the end, it reached about 6 feet in height. So here's goal number 4 on our farm. We're trying to maximize space. And this is inside of one of our high tunnels. You'll notice that we do not grow monoculture in our high tunnel either. We we go all out. We've are all sold out on trying to do intercropping throughout our farm and its systems. And so you'll notice there's a lot of spatial intercropping here. On the left-hand side, that's one of those places where we do relay intercropping with lettuce and tomatoes. At the point this picture is taken, the lettuce has already been harvested, but it would have been on the shade side of the tomatoes, and the tomatoes are in the south in this picture. So the lettuce would have been on our side of the tomatoes at the point that they were growing. And our average lettuce size, we were growing some heirloom lettuces there and leaf lettuce essentially, and we were getting pretty good size at about 0.4 pounds per head. So that's a pretty darn nice size, and they were clean and they were well received. What else you see in this picture is you'll see some green beans next to some peppers. The peppers are a bit younger and the green beans are in harvest mode at this point. In the center, you've got carrots and beets. You've got some onions next to some melons, and I forget what's on the other side of this picture, but there's yet another crop over on the other side. And you'll notice we're using various plant characteristics. You've got the melons next to the onions with different root and nutrient requirements, and the melons use the trellis to make their space work. The obvious downside there is you have to train the melons, but once you get them trained, they tend to do a pretty good job staying there. The variety that we're using in this picture is Minnesota Midget, which tends to have good strong tendrils, and it tends to stay well behaved on that. So that would be one of the things I would say is if you're growing melons inside like this, you want something that stays on the trellis pretty well. And here's another example of spatial compatibility. We've got sunflowers here, and of course I neglected to take this picture when the lettuce was in full. You know, these are the lettuce that are at the tail end where they weren't necessarily ones I was going to harvest. But this is actually a picture in late July when lettuce typically bolts in our area of Iowa. But we put sunflowers on the west side of this field, and it did two things for us. One is it shaded our lettuce for part of the day, especially the later part of the day when things were a little bit warmer. But it also cut down the wind that was coming through that would desiccate the lettuce over time. So it's doing two things to help us keep that lettuce from bolting so we can have decent sized lettuce. It's not going to be as big as our spring lettuce, but it's still going to be decent sized, and it's not going to have a bitter taste because we're trying to keep the temperature down using plants to do so. You'll also notice in the background, we've got a bush line there. So that bush line is also providing us a perennial intercrop in a way. So we're far enough away from the bush line that we can grow, but we're close enough to the bush line that we have some protection from some of the elements. And then goal number 5 is we're trying to disrupt pest and disease patterns. One of the things that we have done frequently is we will grow a row of tomatoes, and we will grow a row of basil in between. And we don't need this much basil, I'll be perfectly honest, but we can use the basil on our farm, and we do sell some of it. But the basil is there partly to attract pollinators, and it's there partly to simply disrupt the disease and pest patterns. We have tried actually to even put basil plants in between tomatoes in the row, and that works at some level. We didn't find that it was that much more beneficial beyond having this nice strong hedge of basil in between our rows of tomatoes. So it was maybe not worth doing extra, but it sure was worth doing this much. Here's another example of some intercropping. We've got onions, and I believe that year we had one bed with 3 rows of onions, and then we've got single rows, single beds of broccolis, cauliflowers, cabbages. And inside of those broccoli and cauliflower rows, we've got marigolds every so often. So we're trying to split that up. And this is late in the season, so you'll probably notice that you can't see the marigolds so well because they now have broccoli leaves over them. We did not really notice a whole lot of competition. Part of the reason we chose marigolds is we've tried other plants, and we didn't really notice a whole lot of issues with competition between the marigolds and the brassica. And that's one of the things we're looking for, is if we're looking to add a little diversity in there, we watch as we experimented, and there were some plants that we would look at and notice that the nearby broccoli plant, for example, was smaller than its companions. And that's an indicator that maybe the extra plant you've thrown in there is possibly causing you some problems. And so maybe that's not the best choice to be mixing in there. We found marigolds work pretty well, so we stuck with that. We also found that calendula was fine. And so we used both of those as plants that we do. You'll notice on the left-hand side that we put in a little bit of late season. I think we put in some annual rye that year towards the end of the season as a late cover. So there's some relay intercropping going on over there. And sometimes annual ryegrass is something we can do, whereas in between the rows, we'll plant it, let it get established when clearly the broccoli or the brassica has reached a stage where it's going to actually start heading out. And then we can plant in there and let it grow and everything's fine. And it's actually kind of nice. If you get fall rains, you're not walking in mud quite so much when you have the cover crop in the rows. I've got this picture in here. This is a head lettuce. I believe this is Copenhagen Market, if I remember correctly. And you'll notice there's still presence of pests, but that presence of pests does some cosmetic damage on the outer leaves that are not part of the marketability of the particular cabbage. And we know that Copenhagen Market is probably a variety that is more likely to attract some pests as opposed to some of the others. And so in a way, they're almost a trap crop. But we find that the heads themselves are very rarely compromised, which means that we're doing just fine, because I'm not selling people the outer leaves anyway. And frankly, we want to have some pests because we want to have a good environment for our predators. And if you get rid of all of the pests and there's nothing for the predators to eat, you won't have predators. And then for that year that things are exceptional and pest pressure flows over into our farm, we don't have a predator population, we're going to be in trouble. So we're not looking to eradicate all pests, and having a little bit of evidence of them is not necessarily a bad thing. So here's another SARE project or a SARE product that we did. In this case, we were trying to figure out how close we should plant those beans and potatoes, because I mentioned a while back, we believe that planting bush beans next to potatoes and eggplant are a good practice. It'll help us with the Colorado potato beetle. So this time what we tried to do is we said, all right, we're going to do this two ways. One way is to make a bed where we plant both beans and potatoes in the same bed. And the other way is to plant potatoes and beans in separate beds. And we'll see what ends up happening as far as that's concerned. So that's what this looks like here. And here's the shared bed in June. And this is right after we had done a little bit of cultivation, and I think we'd spread a little bit of mulch. And things are progressing reasonably well. You can see the beans on the left and the potatoes in the right in each bed. And that's what that looks like in June. So looks like we're pretty much on track. And here is the separate bed. And in the separate bed, we would run 2 rows of beans next to each other and a single row of potatoes. And it's the same day we cultivated. We tried to do a good job of making sure that we did everything on the same day, so the experiment was run well. And here's what the shared bed looks like in July. And you'll notice that both are canopying very well. Both are probably about where you would expect them to be in Northeast Iowa in July as far as size and development stage. And here is the separate bed, and we've got the same kind of thing going on where they're actually looking to be at about the same level of development. So that's not an issue as far as that's concerned. Now, as far as the Colorado potato beetle was concerned that year, we really didn't have a whole lot of pressure unless it was at the ends of the rows. So what that tells me is there were Colorado potato beetles, but the Colorado potato beetle was pretty much where there wasn't as much edge contact, if you will, between the two kinds of crops. But there were Colorado potato beetles. What we were really interested in, though, was, okay, do we get the same kind of yields? If we actually plant beans and potatoes right next to each other in the same bed, surely they're going to affect the crop production. And what we learned is sometimes that depends on the variety that you're growing. So If you take a look at these bean numbers that you have right here, you've got the two different kinds and you've got the two different measurements for pounds per foot. You'll find that jade in particular liked to be by itself, whereas provider didn't really seem to care. So whether it was planted next to itself or whether it was planted next to a potato, it could make a difference depending on the variety. But provider didn't really seem to matter all that much. As far as the potatoes are concerned, you'll notice that Rio Grande, it seemed to matter. And Purple Majesty, it really didn't seem to matter. So it depended on the variety. So sometimes one of the things that you have to consider is when you're doing intercropping, you have to consider your variety choice might have something to do with what you decide to do as far as intercropping is concerned. And remember, single bed or shared bed, both of them showed benefits as far as we were wanting for the Colorado potato beetles. So there was still benefits either way. So here's where we get kind of scientific and mathy on all of you. And those of you who don't like math and don't want to, you can kind of glaze your eyes over for a second. But what I wanted to point out to you is that if you decided to do intercropping, it's entirely possible that you won't get the same yield per foot or yield per acre or whatever number you use for your yield for a particular crop as you would if it was a monocrop. However, if you're doing two cash crops together and each of them maybe produce, let's look at that first one where it says Provider and Rio Grande. So Provider's a bean, Rio Grande's a potato. If a Provider produces at 80% the normal when it's in a monocrop, and Rio Grande produces at 70% the normal, you're still getting 1.53, a 50% higher production rate for that bed. You're getting more product for that bed. It's just not all the same product. Now, of course, when we had things in a shared bed, there is the issue of more labor. So now you have to ask yourself the question, well, is this worth more labor? But I want you to just think about, look what you can possibly get when you do intercropping. You just can't compare only against a monocrop for the single crop. You have to take a look at both crops together and decide how much am I getting per square foot or per row foot or per bed foot, whatever measurements you decide to use. And that'll give you a real value as to whether this intercropping is doing something for you or not. Remember, I'm not saying you want to do intercropping just because. I want you to do intelligent intercropping in a way that works in your system, that you can actually get some of the benefits of intercropping. And so I'm just going to go to this last slide where my cat reminds me I should listen to questions and respond to them. And we'll go from there. And I'll put the last slide on here so you actually can have contact information for me and see the 3 SARE grants that our farm did over the years. There we go. So I'll start answering this question and continue to feel free to insert more into the chat. The question is, the rows seem really dense. Is walking a concern? And the answer to your question is, of course, the rows are dense. And yes, of course, walking can be a concern. But remember, the rows are dense at the point the crops are at peak maturity. So you're kind of at a point here where they're at their best canopy. And at that point in time, it's often not harvest time. If you're talking about melons or you're talking about squash, at the point that you have peak leaf canopy, you probably don't want to go out there much anyway. It's at the point that those leaves start to fall down, and that's when you're going to start harvesting. And so that's not really an issue as far as I'm concerned. And when I want to harvest things like squash or melons, I'll sometimes just drive my tractor right to the edge. And then as I harvest and put things into the harvest containers, I'll move the tractor further in. But yes, if you're somebody who has trouble walking, so far I have not, knock on wood, you can hang yourself up on a vine pretty easy. Or of course, as the potatoes and beans go, As they get bigger, the beans get a little bit harder to harvest. But a lot of those beans, the way we did it is we would harvest them twice and then we let them do what they wanted to do after that, because we got our peak production out of them when we wanted it, and the rate of return goes down as you get later. So it's a matter of what your system is and how you work, but they do get kind of dense. And so you can play with your spacing, because I know each farm has different spacing, and that playing with that spacing will determine for you what works for you. Are there crops I would not utilize this method with? I'll start by saying I have tried to do pretty much every vegetable crop that we grow. I've tried to do something as far as intercropping is concerned. And I think pretty much every one of them has some possible intercropping process you could follow. The problem is things can go south quickly if you're not choosing the right spacing. For example, during one of those SARE products, we grew onions and broccoli in the same bed. And what happened there is the onions did not produce well because they were not competing well with the broccoli. And we had a wind that rolled the broccoli over onto the onions, and we just could not get a good onion crop out of that. So we did better with onions in a separate bed from broccoli. And since that time, that's the system we use, is onions are in one bed, broccoli's in a nearby bed, and it works beautifully. So pretty much you need to find your spacing that works with your system, but I do tend to believe that you want to break all of your crops up in some fashion. The only one I get nervous about is if you're into herbs. Dill makes me nervous. I haven't done any. I've tried to keep dill away from everything else. What is a fertility program, and is everything applied at once, and drip irrigation for all crops? I'll do the easy answer first. The easy answer is drip irrigation for all crops is correct. We can use overhead irrigation periodically, especially if we have problems getting all the drip irrigation out, because sometimes labor is an issue. You don't get all the drip lines out. But our goal is to use drip all the time on everything. As far as fertility program is concerned, I guess that answer isn't so difficult either. Often we'll do an application of manure in the fall so that it meets the setback deadlines. So that's an all field application. And then for certain crops, we will do a side dress at the point when the plants are young. So for example, we've been known to side dress things like some of our brassica. But generally speaking, we rely most heavily on that fall application of compost and manure. So that's pretty much where we go with that. We do not do fertigation. If anybody's interested in fertigation through drip line, that's not something we have chosen to do. Have I tried any border plantings or only interseeding in rows? That's a good question too. Yes, we've done border plantings multiple times. In fact, I'll refer you back to the melon experiment, where we actually did a border planting of various flowers and saw an increase in production. But it wasn't until we actually did row and strip intercropping that we really saw the big bonus in production. So all I can say is any diversity you add is likely to provide you with some benefit. But it's like any tool. I mean, if any of you folks use seeders or various cultivators, if you use a finger weeder, you know you've got to dial that thing in so that it works most effectively. It's the same thing with intercropping. You have to dial it in so it works the most effectively with your crops and with your systems. And every farm is slightly different. So you take what I present to you, if it interests you, and you try it out, and then you have to dial it in so it works with what you do the best. Okay, so the question here is, can you address plant spacing or how you adjust as you develop the beds? And I'm going to assume here that we're talking about plant spacing in row, at least to start with, as I develop these beds. I mean, when we talk about plant spacing in rows, I will admit that initially my plant spacing for my crops has always been closer in part because I have a smaller farm, and in part because when we first started farming, we committed to not using pesticides. We weren't particularly good with our intercropping, and our system was out of balance. We didn't have much for predators because they had been pretty much scared away prior to our started stewardship of this farm, because there was a lot of chemical use prior to our arrival. So we planted more than we needed to because we knew we were going to lose a lot of our crops. So we overplanted, and we kind of continued with that. But as far as plant spacing is concerned, it depends on each one. So if I talk about squash, for example, I tend to run those in 5 feet between rows, and I plant these squash plants typically either 12 or 18 inches apart in those rows, depending on the vining length as far as they're concerned. So some of the pumpkins, for example, might vine longer. I go to 18 inches. But then when it comes to planting, say, nasturtiums in the middle of those rows, then I'm able to, especially with the 18-inch spacing, put a nasturtium in between each one. And usually if it's foot-long spacing, I'll put a nasturtium for in between every couple plants. So it would be melon, nasturtium, melon, nasturtium, that kind of thing. So that's kind of how we address some of those spacing issues, but it's very crop dependent. It's a difficult question to answer well, because we could talk about each one. If you're talking about zinnias, for example, we were basically going over the single row of zinnias, and we went over it with the seeder set properly for zinnias, but we went over the row twice. So we were double seeding our zinnia row to create a very dense bed. We were wanting them to grow close and make a hedge, because that actually prevents certain melons from getting through them. It's almost like putting a wall there, so the melons go up to it and then go next to it. And that prevents them from intruding upon another melon crop. So if I've got 2 melon crops with different days to maturity, that actually is a way to control it. I'm looking at the time and I'm seeing 12:15, and I know people have other things to go to. Are we at a point, or should I talk about the SARE process? I can do that. So talking about the SARE process in itself, the basic idea is SARE every year puts out a call for people who have projects, farmer rancher projects, if you will. And when we write those projects, you need to come up with a plan. Basically, the plan is, here's the problem I'm looking to solve, and here is my plan for how I would like to try and approach that. You need to include a budget for the things that you're looking to acquire, so you can actually make that plan follow. Basically, it does a good job. You would do it well to try and get somebody else to read through it that's maybe done a SARE grant before, which is something I'm happy to do for folks. You submit it, and it basically goes to a committee that reviews all of the applications, and they determine which ones they're going to fund each year. You may or may not get the full funding depending on your budget and depending on what you have proposed. Typically, a SARE grant runs for 2 years, so you could try something out for 2 seasons, which I particularly like. And after each season, you need to complete a report. And after the second season, you complete a final report, at which point you get the last bit of your funding. So you will get some funding to start, some funding in the middle, and then you get the rest of your funding at the end. And it's contingent on you completing the report. Hopefully that was a good summary. Thank you again for working with me. I appreciate the fact that people were willing to accept a talking head on a screen. I once again, I wish I could be there in person.